Okay, so we are going to be talking about child trafficking in South Africa. And we are going to be chatting child trafficking with Katie Modrau, South African country manager for A21, and Chantell Brecht, A21 hotline manager. Welcome to the both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
What is the significance of A21? Why the name?
You know, that's a question we actually get a lot. When we established ourselves about 16 years ago, we had a slogan, abolishing slavery or abolishing injustice in the 21st century. So it was A21. We've since changed our slogan to abolishing slavery everywhere, forever, but our name has stayed A21.
I think a lot of people, and this past week, now let me not talk about a lot of people, this is personal for me. I just got the sense that it is a little more widespread than I anticipated in the country. We're talking child trafficking.
Yes.
And that I've been living in my middle class bubble and I've maybe forsaken my working class kind of roots. And I also need to understand my response to this, just how widespread is child trafficking in South Africa?
I think that is the golden question, is how widespread is it? And over the last, I would say 3 to 4 years, a lot of studies have been done to try and establish what the prevalence of trafficking is in South Africa. The reality is that it is very underreported. There was a study recently that came out by Marcel van der Walt, and he spoke about the underreporting of human trafficking just because it's not identified. Often it's seen as gender-based violence or missing children or drug addiction or, just a labor dispute. And so the actual prevalence is quite difficult to establish, but the studies are coming out. What I can say is that it is definitely more on the radar of government. It's definitely more on the radar of people. And we have definitely seen an increase in cases identified in the last 5 years for sure.
What forms does it take?
Trafficking.
Yes.
So that is a really great question. When I say to you human trafficking, what's the first thing you think of?
I'm not quite certain.
Often sex, right? So sex trafficking, maybe child sex tourism. Maybe we always think about the movie Taken, for example. That movie did incredible things to bring human trafficking on the radar. But it also makes us only think about sex trafficking. But human trafficking can take many forms. We see sex trafficking, we see labor trafficking, domestic servitude, very common in South Africa. Basically a live, work in nanny household slave, for example, very common and culturally accepted within South Africa. Then you've got organ removals, and for Muti purposes, very underreported. And I think maybe potentially we're speculating what we're looking at in this case, in this situation. And then obviously you have in other parts of the world, child soldiers is also a form of trafficking.
Sure. I thought for a second you were talking about adult trafficking. We're talking child trafficking. Would they apply to all of those categories that you've mentioned?
100%.
Sex trafficking, work trafficking?
That's correct. If you're looking in sex trafficking, for example, there is a demand for irregular type of sexual fantasies. So that is sex with minors, sex with specific looking people, things that you can't necessarily get on the quote unquote acceptable market where someone is willingly engaging in what we would call sex work. But when it's deviant behavior, for example, you're looking at somebody who's forced to be there, and children is one of them. There is a child sex tourism element that we have to think about. When you're talking about labor, if you think about mines, illegal mines, small hands, small children, easy to get into small places in mines. If you're looking in agriculture, the smaller sensitive hands, they don't damage the fruit with picking. We see a lot in, is it the DRC, those big mines for, all the parts for our cell phones. We maybe don't have that in South Africa, but we definitely have children working in labor trafficking.
Okay, let's look at South Africa. So what child is most susceptible, most vulnerable to the practice?
That's a really good question. You've put the key word there, which is vulnerability. You have to look at the things that make us vulnerable. And when we understanding vulnerability, a lot of the studies we're looking at systemic and internal vulnerabilities. So systemic corruption, lack of access to housing, water, education, those things that you can't necessarily control as an individual. That's the country, the GDP of the country, etc. But then you've got internal or personal vulnerabilities. What's the home life like? Do you have, is there alcohol abuse in the home? Is there previous abuse in your history? Do you have access to education? Where are you living? Is there running water? Do you have previous awareness about human trafficking? Do you have safety, protective nets around you? Do you have a safe community, a safe family life? All of those things would render somebody vulnerable. We see our homeless youth, for example, incredibly vulnerable. The LGBTQI plus community, very vulnerable. Those all personal vulnerabilities render someone more susceptible to believing recruitment methods, believing lies of others, or just not having someone to have their back and protect them should a recruitment ring or trafficking ring be in the area and be looking for them.
And in terms of demographic, is any child more affected than the other? We're talking age brackets, we're talking maybe population group as well?
That's a really intricate question to answer. It depends on the type of trafficking you're looking for. We see children, and this might not always be for trafficking, but children very young going missing, it could be trafficking for adoption. But you also we've seen adults 35, 40, 50 being trafficked for sex as well. So it really depends on the type of trafficking that you're looking at. And I would say most of the cases that we work with is in the teenage bracket.
Okay, so how do we determine, or how do what defines the term trafficked? When is a child trafficked and when is a child abused?
So when you're looking at trafficking, you're going to be looking at the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act. There are 3 elements that define a crime of trafficking. You need the act, which is harboring, selling, keeping somebody, transporting somebody. You need the means. How did you recruit them?
So does that mean walking with a child into the veld, for example, as well?
Yes.
So that's technically trafficking. Okay.
Yes, it could mean keeping them in your house for somebody else. People can be trafficked within their own home.
That's an important thing. Yeah.
They're being harbored, so they're being kept in a place that they cannot leave. Means is how you recruited them. This is actually in the law irrelevant for children. You don't have to prove that they were recruited in any way. But then the act, how did you exploit them? And when there is some kind of financial, commercial, monetary, or in-kind gain, that's when you would call it trafficking. Gotcha. So I might not be earning money from it, but I could be gaining standing in the community. I could be staying in good graces with gangsters. I could be, I'm protected because I hand over this person. So it's the gain that comes from it.
I think that's such an important point that you're making, because I think a lot of us are caught in the mind that maybe the child is locked up in a dark truck and kind of taken off to a dark place somewhere far away. But you're saying a child can be trafficked in their home.
They can. And we've had cases as such as, we might only come across them when they're adults, but through their whole teenage years, they have been trafficked within their own home. It's an uncle, it's a caregiver that's holding them captive. They might even be going to school. But somebody is benefiting off exploiting them, making money or in-kind benefits off exploiting them.
It's an extremely difficult conversation to have, and especially on a Friday, but it's a necessary conversation. Of course, it comes in the wake of everything that we've spoken about and heard in relation to Joshlin. In this past week, remains missing Joshlin Smith. And of course, we've seen some people appear in court as well. So we're talking about child trafficking, understanding it a little more so. And I think that could drive maybe a better response to the challenge that we have. This is a sickness. Katie Modrau is South African country manager for A21 and Chantell Brecht, A21 hotline manager. While the ads were playing, you were saying that charges of trafficking are not easily leveled.
No.
Why is that, Katie?
Because it's a fairly new crime and a fairly new, when I say law, in the 10-year mark, it's not easy that a trafficking charge will be given unless they have proof that they believe that they can prove it in court. There's many other laws that can be leveraged, when you are dealing with cases like this. So the fact that human trafficking charge has been laid, there must be quite strong proof that there has been some kind of gain, that there was some kind of sale or some kind of benefit in some way for a trafficking charge to be laid.
Are we talking in the case of Joshlin Smith here specifically?
Yes.
Human trafficking charge laid, so there must be some evidence that supports that particular charge. And when there's no evidence?
We've had multiple cases where we've done screenings and we believe that there's definitely trafficking within this person's story, but there's not enough evidence to prove it. And so we may be able to assist and support a survivor, but those charges won't stand in court and it won't go to court. So that's why we're saying when a case does go to court, when there is a trafficking charge, you can be sure that the MPA and that the police know that they can support that with evidence.
Is it a pure transaction that is evidence, or is it more than just a transaction?
It can be more than transaction. As I said, the law does account for, it doesn't have to be monetary gain. It can be, benefits in kind. And so when you're talking about trafficking charges, in general, if you're talking about someone who owns a property where trafficking is taking place, that landlord could be charged with human trafficking for benefiting financially off of what's happening at their premises. If you have somebody who drives a taxi and is driving people from Eastern Cape to Cape Town for domestic servitude, they could be charged for trafficking. They're driving people. So there are many elements that could be prosecuted for trafficking within the crime. But as I say, MPA is not quick to slap that on any case unless they can prove it.
I think I want to turn to Chantell Brecht while we just assess everything that you've shared, Katie. Chantell, you're the hotline manager at A21.
Yes, that's correct.
And I'm kind of hoping and praying at this moment in time that it's not a busy hotline.
It's a very busy hotline. Very busy. We get calls daily throughout the day. I would say between 150 calls per week. Last year we had over 3,000 calls that were human trafficking related, which was, I think, over 79% of calls that come through the hotline. So
who's calling you?
Mostly community members, government departments, a wide range of stakeholders that call us. Victims themselves, yes. Often they are, in the situation and they call us, they need help out of the situation. So then what our role is, we do all the planning and coordinating behind rescuing that victim of trafficking. So we're taking down the information, we're reporting to the necessary authorities to go and extract that victim out of trafficking, and then coordinating services further as, aftercare services.
Would you have some examples of the circumstances that victim was confronting at the time of the call?
Yeah, we've had a lot of reports of sex trafficking this year. So we've seen a trend where victims have been recruited from other provinces to Cape Town and are sexually exploited here. They face sexual abuse daily. They are
physical abuse daily.
Forced to take drugs every day and go out on the streets and forced to be, prostitutes. And they have no freedom of movement. They are trapped in these houses. They have nowhere to go. Their phones are being monitored. So that's kind of what a day in the life looks like for them.
I'm listening to you and I'm overwhelmed. You there at the coal face. How do you deal?
I think, taking these calls, it's an emotional job. I will say that you need your own coping mechanism to deal with these cases. And, when you go home at the end of the day, there needs to be a divide. So when you get home, you need to try and, shut off from what you've heard during the day. And sometimes that's really hard. But I will say, I think the thing that keeps me going is when I've taken a call and I've, seen that victim being extracted out of the situation. We've given a little bit of hope, for a fresh start, and that's, I think, what keeps me going. And
yeah, I think the fact that you're making a difference, that it's hard to hear, but it's even harder for someone to be in that situation. And if we can be that gap, or part of the gap, and seeing someone finding their freedom.
We don't have a lot of time left. I want you to tell us, Katie, about our responsibility in response to this challenge. Somebody writes, "Hi, Clarence, South Africa needs to work on better resources." Tell us how, as a society, we need to respond to this scourge.
That's a very loaded question. There is a lot of response that needs to take place. I think firstly, we need to understand trafficking as a whole. I think what's important to understand here is that we often, in cases like this, we think abduction, someone's just been taken, that's how trafficking, and we have this heightened anxiety. The first responsibility we have as society is to understand how this actually happens. Trafficking happens out of desperation. 31% of the cases we had last year were trafficked by a family member or a friend. Someone they knew and were trusted, and they were integrally involved in making sure that this person was exploited. We need to know that as a society so that we are protecting those who are vulnerable. We're raising awareness. We're making sure the average Joe...
And I think we must trust our instincts, because when we see something strange, We mustn't write it off as somebody else's problem.
100%. That's actually what we see a lot on the hotline is if someone calls it in, you don't know that 3 other people have called in the same address, the same location, the same car. We've had multiple addresses that come up all the time. When we're able to send those, you know, those diagrams, those, you know, those maps to the Hawks, they are then able to go in and do raids. Never underestimate the power of reporting something that you see.
It is what you see.
Indeed.
And report it. How do you sustain yourself? Very important work that you do.
We rely on grants, we rely on individual donors, and then we also, our CEO, her responsibility or part of what she does is she generates income for us as well through speaking events, etc. But, you know, we're always open to partnering, we're always open to donations. We run a freedom center where survivors come in during the day, but we rely on the everyday person.
Our challenge is time. Where can we find out more about you?
A21.org. Check us out on all socials. The SA Trafficking Hotline is where you can find information about the hotline, but A21.org. And I just want to say there, in terms of trafficking for children, if you want some information on how to talk to your children about trafficking in a safe, child-friendly way, we have lots of resources on our website for that.
Yeah, and is it necessary for us to get paranoid?
No, vigilant and aware, yes.
I think vigilant is the word that we all need to apply in response to this scourge. Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you very much, Chantell. Your time is appreciated.
Thanks for having us.
So to your work.